Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first colloquium this fall on Unthinking the Climate Bomb, Civilizational Crises, Class Struggles, and Climate History in the Holocene and Beyond. We would like to acknowledge that even though we are not gathering in person, we live and work on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. This includes Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Colloquium First Nations. We acknowledge that we are all settlers on this land. Before we continue, I would like to provide a brief introduction to Jason. Jason, as you know, is our guest speaker. He's a professor of sociology from Binghamton University. He's an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton. He's author or editor of several books, including this, Capitalism in the Web of Life. I highly recommend you read this when you get a chance. And the other one is Anthropocene or Capitalocene. This is among the books that he published, so I'm just talking about these two, which I read and I really liked. He has published many articles in the prestigious journals and received awards. Among them are Ellis Hamilton Prize of the American Society for Environmental History, the Distinguished Scholarship Award of the Political Economy of World Systems section of the ASA, and the Byers and Bernstein Prize in Agrarian Change. He coordinates World Ecology Research Network, and also one of the latest books is called A History of the World in 7 Chief Things, and he published this together with the Raj Patel. The format will be as follows. Dr. Moore will present his talk first. He will take about an hour, after which we will take questions. Actually, you can begin to type your questions once he begins his talk, anytime you want on the question and answer section of this on the screen. You will see it at the bottom of your screen. You can type anytime. I and Gabby will coordinate facilitate these question and answer session. Gabby Arena is an MA student in our department in sociology and anthropology. She will help us with this section. We will try to get as many questions as possible within the remaining time of 20 minutes or 30 minutes at the end. So please be brief in your questions and use respectful language. The session will be recorded and we will make it available about a week perhaps later or after the talk. So before I take so much time, I will let Jason to begin to give his talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to get our screen sharing going here. And while that is happening, I want to say how much I appreciate what an honor it is to be talking talking at your invitation, Ildes, and to speak to the Department of Sociology and Anthropology's opening seminar series, Colloquium series. This is now the 3rd fall in a row that I have been speaking with professors and students at Simon Fraser, and I want to say it's always been a tremendous joy and extraordinarily generative. So I'm looking forward to, well, hopefully provoking you in a way that can be generative for all of us today. So my title for today's talk comes from the metaphor of the atomic bomb that was prevalent across the era of the Cold War and has stuck with us in powerful ways, especially around the question of nature and the environmental imaginary. And I'm going to do something that might cause, well, I tell my students that this might give you an ice cream headache. It's an ice cream headache kind of intellectual problem. We need to look at the climate imaginary and the dominant climate imaginary as it's taken shape out of various forces over the past 5 centuries. But we also need to look at the history of climate struggles as we walk through a long history of those. So first, the commonplace question, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? And with that, why the erasure of popular revolts and systemic crises in climate history? Here we have illustrations from the Grande Jacquerie, the Great Peasant Revolt in France in 1358, the Haitian Revolt Revolution from 1791, and the Goths crossing the Danube in 376. 2 years later, there would be a combination of a general strike and armed insurgency that dealt the Roman legions at Adrianople their greatest defeat since Cannae several centuries BC. So these are crucial indicators that there is a, well, largely hidden history of popular revolt, climate shift, and systemic crisis that is far from the gloom and doom of the dominant catastrophist doomsday imaginary. So of course we're living in the midst of, and well, not unprecedented, but certainly over the past 12,000 years, an unprecedented moment of climate change, the end of the Holocene, what we want to, how we want to signify the era that comes next, Anthropocene or something else, is very much open for debate. But we are for sure living through a climatological turning point, much more fundamental, much more dramatic than any we have seen in the history of class society. Oh, and speaking of class society, the whole reason why we have this Holocene in the first instance is from what Victor Child long ago called the urban revolution, but was also, he understood as a good Marxist archaeologist, the emergence of class society. And what Ruddiman over the past 2 decades and other Earth system scientists have been figuring out is that the tendency for CO2 concentrations to fall across one of the interglacial periods, like the one we're living in, the Holocene, was somehow unusually reversed, and you can see the reversal of this against the natural CO2 trend of the previous 19 interglacial periods, that we see this very unusual reversal of the downward movement of CO2 concentrations right around 8,000 years ago. And I think what the archaeological evidence suggests is that the emergence of class society, very, very primitive to be sure, not elaborated technical divisions of labor, but class society and the emergence of steady cereal agriculture, including rice agriculture with its methane, was a kind of Archimedean lever of Holocene stability over this long 11,700 year period. So what class society gives us, it will also take away, as we'll learn. Now, the importance of this recognition that the turning point in the Holocene, the mid-Holocene stabilization of CO2 levels, and in fact, their slight elevation over the next 8,000 years or so, opens up. It opens up questions about not the relation of an abstract man and an abstract nature, but of class and climate, of course, both broadly conceived. These are 2 very, very simple proxies, and for those of you who know the climate science history very well, there are lots of holes we can poke in here, but it's illustrative of the basic dynamic, that unfavorable shifts in northern hemispheric climate, and that can mean a lot of different things, winter severity, but also cool summers. We can get into all of this, but in the northern hemisphere, what we see here on the top, fluctuations in solar intensity, on the bottom, variations in volcanic activity. We don't like to admit it, but volcanism is a huge part of human history. What these correspond to are significant moments, either of the formation of new class structures. So this was the case in the Roman Empire after the 3rd century BCE. It was the case with Carolingian Europe in the first feudal revolution and then the second feudal revolution as well. But it's also intimately connected to moments of civilizational crisis, which themselves look different. Now, don't worry, we'll have a chance to revisit this as we move on, so this won't be the last time. And lo and behold, here we have it. We can identify at least 4 major moments between the crisis of the Roman West in the 5th century and the great age of Atlantic revolutions. In fact, the era of the Red Atlantic, as Linebaugh and Redeker like to point to it. These are all moments of climate conjuncture. They are moments of climate, class, or climate and political destabilization. And these moments are completely invisible if we stick to a simplified and mechanical man-nature model, or also if we use a kind of systems thinking in which you have complex interactions of the variables. And we'll come back to those kinds of questions soon enough. Well, but here's the punchline. Moments of unfavorable climate change are moments of political possibility. Now, what exactly is unfavorable and what's unfavorable for one social organization or mode of production will not be for another. But it holds true that across the Northern Hemisphere over the past 2,000 years, dramatic climate shifts and moments of popular revolt and the unraveling of class structures that formed in a different climate, a warmer and generally more favorable climate, those arrangements came unraveled. Well, we should ask why. So this is the climate imaginary moment as we reflect on the history, and we'll go back and forth between these two moments. Why the end of the world is easy to imagine, but not capitalism, and why the erasure of actually existing climate crises. And I think a lot of the answer comes down to an ideological one, which is we have met the enemy and he is us. This has a longer history. This particular poster, which some of you I'm sure recognize, comes from the work of a famous cartoonist, Walt Kelly. This is a poster for the first Earth Day. And it basically tells us man and nature is the model. And this indeed is the overriding and dominant mode of conceptualizing and narrating climate and other forms of environmental changes, in which environment goes in one box and society goes in another, and we see a ping pong of cause and effect. We see interaction effects, but the emergent totalities of how human relations of power production and reproduction, of domination and accumulation, form and reform, not just through the web of life, but in the modern world through ruling abstractions of capital N nature and capital S society, or as early modern people would have spoke of it, civilization and savagery. That has remained a real intellectual problem that is too often, I think, taken for granted. We too often take man and nature, civilization, society and nature as unproblematic descriptions. What I want to suggest is that these are two of the greatest inventions of modernity, and that their conceptualizations were not just about epistemology and philosophy and all of that. They were practical instruments of domination, of genocide, and of the appropriation of unpaid work in the interests of turning all life into profit-making opportunities. So I use this language of ruling abstraction that is a fusion, for those of you who are interested in some of the epistemological and philosophical readings of historical materialism and the history of capitalism. This takes Son Reddel's concept of real abstraction, and as practical abstractions that arise through the formation of the law of value as a law of cheap nature. We'll get to that in a moment. From its earliest moments, that is, the militarized accumulation strategies of conquest, slaving, and financialization that are there from the beginning of capitalism are fundamental to the emergence of capitalism as a world ecology of power, profit, and reproduction. But also, of course, invokes Marx and Engels on the ruling ideas of every era are the ideas of the ruling class, including, and you can see the last line, which I italicized, they rule as a class and determine the extent and compass of a historical epoch. So this is at the center of worldwide debates over planetary justice today. Is this a case of the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene? And then what kind of Anthropocene and what kind of Capitalocene is there? And I'll return to this at the very end of the talk because there are two Anthropocenes. One is a geological Anthropocene concerned with the geological analysis of planetary history, and another is a geohistorical argument that humanity, and various forces associated with that are in fact driving the crisis. For me, the Capitalocene says that the drivers of planetary crisis turn on capitalism as a system of domination and accumulation, and that is always looking for cheap natures, including cheap human natures at every turn. So for me, the Capitalocene is a dynamic synthesis of the climate class divide, climate apartheid, and climate patriarchy. And we'll have an opportunity to come back to that, but let me just footnote this because I think it's important. Climate apartheid, climate patriarchy, and the climate class divide are not the results of global warming. They are the drivers of global warming and carbonization. So when we are confronting the dominant environmental imaginary, which tells us that climate change is made by humans, anthropogenic, we need to return to the longer history, the deep roots of what I call imperial or bourgeois naturalism, and the ways that it was linked up to civilizing projects from the very beginning. And so we have Christianizing, civilizing, and developmentalist projects successively and interpenetrating all through the history of capitalism, but also in successive historical stages. So we need to grasp that the organizing premises of capitalism as a system of power, which is always oriented towards the creation and support of profit-making opportunities for the bourgeoisie, are these ruling abstractions, this kind of binary of humanity and civilization as ruling abstractions in which the rest of life, including virtually all human beings, are moved onto the terrain of nature. This is what Nestor King once famously called capitalism's mode of human sacrifice. And in a moment where I worry that a certain identitarian impulse is pushing the climate justice discussion alongside an equally problematic class reductionist move, we can see this in debates over Anthropocene and Capitalocene. We need to be clear that these real abstractions serve a specific end, which is the world rate of profit and the worldwide rate of exploitation, above all centering on what I call super exploitation, the appropriation of the unpaid work of women, slaves, nature, and colonies, to paraphrase Maria Mies. And what I want to point out here is that these civilizing projects are not merely sort of cultural projects floating in the ether. They are practical and immediate instruments of domination. And so here, this is a snapshot of the Catholic landowning in Ireland, basically before and after Cromwell's genocidal invasion in the middle of the 17th century, which was not only a counter-revolutionary movement in relation to the English Revolution, but also a genocidal move in which about half of the indigenous population in Ireland was killed off. But this was not isolated, as you can read there on the right, that the English view of the Irish as wild and savage and uncivilized was the same view as the Spaniards towards Peruvians. The Andeans were called naturales. The Dutch in Southeast Asia had the same kind of language to describe the occupants of the Spice Islands, many of which they deported and executed in the interest of monopolizing the spice trade. But so too, as Silvia Federici has done masterfully, this is also the moment of gendered proletarianization and the gendered counter-revolution within Europe that is rapidly and radically globalized in this period 1550 to 1700. Remember those dates because those are the dates of capitalism's first climate crisis. They are the moment of the long, cold 17th century, and this is the moment, not the 19th century, this is the moment when we see coming together all the modern features of capitalism as a system, as a logic of power, accumulation, and the appropriation of unpaid work. Here I just give you a sense to understand that these moments, these civilizing projects could take many forms, including this gendered counter-revolution, and it always paid great dividends. That's why this happened in the particular form that it did. To be sure, feudal Europe was not a feminist paradise, but it was significantly and meaningfully different in almost every element of women's lives than it was in early capitalist Europe, and indeed across the capitalist world ecology of that era. So this is a matter that's often put in terms of culture and domination and disconnected from the questions of class exploitation, capital accumulation, and their environmental histories. And that's really the big project here, is how do we put together webs of life, the accumulation of capital, and the fundamental enduring structures of domination, above all, those of what I'm calling climate apartheid and climate patriarchy. This is civilizing projects are those projects because at the end of the day, they create sources of surplus profit. And indeed, the orthodox Marxist and Anglo-centric vision of what is a proletarian is not only demonstrably false, but if we are to find an originary proletariat, it is not in places like England, but in the slave plantations of Brazil and the West Indies in this period. In other words, the industrial proletarianization of a later era is very much the result, not the cause, of a drive towards planetary crisis. So one of the confusions sometimes about my work and my perspective is it's often said, well, I deny that the web of life exists. In fact, I embrace the web of life and begin my book, Capitalism and the Web of Life. Its first reference is a reference to the work of Johan Rockström and his fundamental work on planetary boundaries. We need to distinguish the web of life as a process of all life making that encompasses not just humans, but human organizations, from nature as a project of capitalist modernity that is not only challenged by human and extra-human nature, but also calls forth new sources of resistance. And so this is a way of beginning to link the accumulation of capital, the questions of domination and webs of life. And the organizing principle I'm using here is super exploitation. This is the classic question that Marx introduces in the chapter on the working day, on the extension of the working day, the intensification of work, but also crucially, the judicial and cultural mechanisms for suppressing the consumption of the vast majority. You can think of slaves, of women, and of the vast majority of the not the vast majority rather, but of the world's hungry and impoverished today, where we have 2.5 billion or so people experience nutrient deficiencies. This is super exploitation in the sense of what Farshad Araghi calls enforced or coercive underconsumption. So that means that we see across the long arc of capitalism these successive projects that are essentially old wine in new bottles, from the Christianizing impulse of the Spaniards to civilizing projects, manifest destiny in the case of the US. I know Canada had its own set of rationalizing impulses. And then, of course, with Truman's point for post-war American developmentalism. And while these were projects with enormously complex history, and we never want to reduce them, we do want to point out that their world historical pivot ultimately came down to enforcing a high rate of surplus value extraction and the appropriation of unpaid work as capitalists and their empires searched for new and expanded sources of cheap natures, the four cheaps of labor and unpaid work, food, energy, and raw materials. So this is all an opening to what I call the world ecology conversation. Yildiz was so kind as to wave a copy of my Capitalism and the Web of Life, which is a product of and a contribution to this conversation. It is at its heart a way to understand the present climate crisis as the entanglement of bourgeois power and domination with the endless accumulation of capital, with the web of life as both a producer and a product of capitalism and other social formations. And there are a lot of different ways that I can introduce this, but what I would say is that for us, the conceptual questions that are political questions have to be resolved on the terrain of actually existing history. And since the sort of sine qua non of capitalism in that respect is to turn all local history into world historical activity, and we can all think about the clothes we're wearing, the food we eat, the cars we drive, those are all world historical products. That dynamic has been present and intensifying from the very beginning. And so for I and others in the world ecology conversation, it is a way to rethink the history of the modern world as if nature, domination, and capital are all essential to understanding each other. So here we are again at the end of the Holocene, alas. And so for world ecology, the intent is to embrace the geophysical accounts of the climate crisis, and to situate those in the actually existing story of human power, production, reproduction, the drama of human history. And so that's what we're looking at. So when I talk about climate crisis as a geohistorical process, that means that we need to move on to the terrain of a dynamic synthesis, because it's important if we wish to answer fundamental questions that relate to power and production and profit and political possibility in the present climate crisis, which is a turning point unlike we have seen since the dawn of the Holocene. And here's a question I give historical materialism a hard time because there's so much good work there. There's also a lot of really undue theoretical orthodoxy, as if Marx came down from the mountains with his ideas written on stone tablets. Almost universally ignored by Marxists has been what Marx and Engels call the first principles, or all historical writing must set out from this embrace of humans and the rest of nature, their words, and the climatic, amongst other climatic conditions. And then the task is to fuse that in a dialectical and dynamic synthesis with the specific class relations that we find in given historical systems and civilizations. That's also linked, as Bellamy Foster and others have done a magnificent job pointing out, with a dynamic towards the exhaustion and destruction of certain forms of natural fertility, for lack of a better term. But what we need to grasp immediately is also these ruling abstractions, especially what Sylvia Wynter famously calls the overrepresentation of the human, which is to say the bourgeoisie's overrepresentation of itself, as if the bourgeoisie is the core of civilized society, represents the best instincts and the best way forward of human society, which of course fits in very well with its civilizing projects, that those who were not white, male, bourgeois, aristocratic were not part of civilization, or not quite part of civilization. And there is a long and complex history that relates to, say, East Asia, a kind of back and forth around Orientalism there that is distinct from what we see in the New World. But nevertheless, every time a European empire lands on the shores of some place outside of Europe, including places like Ireland, all of the inhabitants become lazy, savage, uncivilized in one form or another, and are clearly in need of being developed or civilized or Christianized, as the case may be. One of the fundamental ways of coming to grips with the climate crisis is to come to grips with the long history of bourgeois naturalism and imperial science. And by saying this, I don't mean to suggest that scientists in early modern Europe, or indeed today, are not producing useful knowledge. They are. But as a way of seeing the world, as a cosmology, this is a cosmology that is very much seeing like an empire, seeing like a slave owner. And here we can see these fundamental elements of the emergence of capitalism as a mode of thought. It's substantialism, it's dualism, it's instrumentalism, and it's quantification. And if we reflect for a moment on so much of modern environmentalist thought, especially in the natural and social sciences. They all go back to some kind of systems model, often going back to Jay Forrester and Donnell and Meadows' work on the limits to growth, to which we will return later in this talk. But that kind of systems dynamic thinking very much represents a highly sophisticated version of, well, of all four of these elements that are crucial if we want to unthink the dominant environmental imaginary, if we want to decolonize and declass our environmental imaginaries. So here we go back to Machiavelli and the prophets armed. So on the left, you won't recognize him probably unless you're an Iberianist, but this is Francisco Vitoria, the great natural theologian of the Spanish Empire. On the right is René Descartes. We think of him as a Frenchman, but really he's more a product of Dutch capitalism in the long, cold 17th century. And so for Vitoria, this was God stood before man as the Spaniards stood before the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The indigenous peoples had to be subordinated to the Christianizing project of the Spaniards, which would deliver civilization and salvation. The indigenous peoples were imperfect matter. That was the way that it was thought of. And of course, this was not a minor debate in the history of colonialism. Many of you probably are familiar with the famous debate between Las Casas and Sepulveda at Valladolid in 1550 and 1551 over whether or not indigenous peoples could be enslaved. Now, as it turned out, the supply of potential slaves was dwindling radically by 1550, and we'll return to that as well. So, but these were fundamental moments in the formation of an instrumental rationality, an early form of what Max Weber once called the European rationality of world domination. And indeed, that characterization is not too far off from what many environmental justice, climate justice, and other people, how they characterize the climate NGO industrial complex. But it's not just Vitoria, it's also Descartes, and this separation of thinking things and extended things, the dynamic of domination. We must make ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. And fundamentally, this is a kind of philosophical codification of the separation of mental and manual labor, of thinking and doing. In other words, an incipient global Taylorism revealed in the early plantation, silver mining, and other productivist revolutions of this era. No, indeed, the Fordist assembly line does not begin in the early 20th century. So what bears emphasis is these seemingly abstract questions and philosophical questions were anything but. These were the commonplace tent poles, if you will, of the imperial project, which was, at the end of the day, to produce and reproduce on an extended scale the cheap natures, the four cheaps of labor and unpaid work, food, energy, and raw materials. These were practical instruments, practical guides to domination. And this began to form right in the thick of the first climate crisis, to which we'll turn here very, very soon. But you can see a very, very crudely drawn map here where women, nature, colonies, slaves are all subordinated to the logic of the civilizing impulse, which is to say they were relegated to the zone of nature. The better they could be treated cheaply, in the double sense of that term, treated cheaply in price. Often, as Federici notes, the redefinition of women's work into natural work or non-work, but also the devaluation in an ethico, political, and cultural sense of the work of women, nature, and colonies, and so forth. So that's really crucial. Now we need an interlude to think about the end of the world, because seemingly this has been forgotten not once, but many times by environmentalists, that the end of the world has happened many times over. It was only once the US commits the war crime bombings, the terror bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that it begins to register on the psyche of the denizens of the rich countries, oh my God, maybe we're going to blow everyone up. And, but in fact, the end of the world had already happened many times over. But it hasn't gone away. And here is Wallace Wells, in a very useful book, by the way. So don't think I'm dismissing either Ehrlich or Wallace Wells for specific empirical contributions. But the imaginary of the bomb is still very much with us. And there's a kind of reduction of political choices made to enforce geopolitical interests. That is, in the case of the bombing of Japan, this was a direct and immediate and conscious signal to the Soviets of beware. This is also a moment, so what's happened is that geopolitical moment, the question of power embedded in nuclear hegemony, has been evacuated from the environmentalist sense of the bomb and the destruction of everything that goes with us. Ehrlich's famous book, of course, was called The Population Bomb. This is a metaphor that continues to stick with us very, very strongly. It is, in many ways, not only an American way of thinking, but an especially strong American imaginary, which of course is important in the era of the McDonaldization and Americanization and Facebookization of everything, that America has had a love affair with the apocalypse. And this is something that Betsy Hartman does a magnificent job showing us, and that is very much embedded in the core of the post-1968 environmental imaginary. And this seems to cut across ideological lines. There's an eco-socialist version of this. There's a mainstream big E environmentalist version of this. But again, the end of the world has been affected not once, but many, many times over. And so we want to take into consideration that moment of imperialist violence, the destruction of 2 cities in Japan, as a clear and direct signal to the Soviets to be on the watch, because the US had the capacity to end them. We want to keep that in mind as we think about invocations of the end of the world. And I think one of the reasons why it's easy to imagine the end of the world is because the instruments of the potential end of the world have been with us since 1945, and capitalism was based on ending the worlds of a great many of peoples all across the planet for many, many centuries. So we can go through this more or less quickly, but I think that there's an important climate history element to this. And indeed, we get stories of the collapse of Rome as a kind of end time story, and many, many other narratives of civilizations around the planet exceeded their carrying capacity because of overpopulation and then collapsed. I'm not convinced by that. I don't think the evidence is very good for that. And I want to go through a series of moments that really is a kind of anti-Jared Diamond, anti-Paul Ehrlich, but also an alternative to socialist visions of catastrophe as coming on. The first is the rise of Rome, where we can chart the rise of what Carol Crumley calls the Mediterranean ecotone. That's on the right. Sorry, I should have inverted them. But on the right, you can see that from 300 BCE, the Mediterranean climate begins to extend eventually all the way nearly to the coast of France, France's coastal boundary with the North Sea and the English Channel. And then by 500 AD has sunk, that Mediterranean ecotone has gone all the way back to Northern Africa. This is crucial. This is the era, the 300 BC for the next 400 or 500 years, the era of the Roman climatic optimum. To make a long story short, because I could give a whole talk on the dynamics of this process, Rome had the wind at its backs, but the Roman West was the most vulnerable to climate shift, so the Eastern Roman Empire survives. But what we see here is the end of the Roman warm period, and the very much sinks, and the coming of the Dark Ages cold period comes comes about at a period when there is the worst, most severe drought across the Eurasian steppe over the past 2,000 years. So that's ultimately what's driving the barbarian invasions. And as I suggested earlier, this is not a story of terrible barbarians destroying everything. Indeed, I often say eco-socialism or barbarism. I'll take barbarism. The barbarians, in this case, the barbarians who in part brought down the Roman West, ended one of human history's greatest slave societies. And indeed, the living standards for peasants expanded, improved as peasants reorganized themselves into villages after the tyranny of the Roma villa system, the latifundia system, and pursued diversified livelihood strategies. Archaeologists suggest that not only were class inequalities lower, but that given that there was no dramatic decline in population, but rather a long gradual decline, the relations between men and women were much more equal, and the fertility regime was therefore much lower. And so what we can see here is simply the class dynamics of climate and class from the end of the Roman warm period through the late antique Little Ice Age and into the medieval climate anomaly, sometimes also called the medieval warm period. It wasn't warm everywhere, but in Europe it was. This is important because the dynamics of class society work in and through climate, and although climate is autonomous until fairly late, and we're going to get to that in a moment, it's worth keeping in our minds. So this is just another way of visualizing how climate shifts and the conditions of well-being in class society are all linked together. These are certainly open to challenge, but I think the broad contours of the argument really deserve to be debated much more seriously. So we have one crisis, the crisis of the Roman West in the 5th century. We have another about 1,000 years later. And here I'll just, if you're not familiar with the climate history, I'll give you a few images. Don't worry, this won't be the first, but you see medieval warm period into the Little Ice Age. You can see this here for winter severity, I think in the early Little Ice Age for England. But this was also a moment of class revolt. Now, the typical Malthusian story about the 14th century is entirely and emphatically misleading at best. This was not a Malthusian crisis of too many people on the land. Indeed, the great medievalist Guy Bois points out in a study of medieval Normandy that even in 1300, the peasant agriculture could have fed 2 or 3 times as many people, but landlord control over agriculture and the enforcement of a grain monoculture, especially a rye monoculture, because wheat was failing in the climate of the time, led to not only amino starvation and malnutrition, but also to a spiral of agroecological exhaustion and an increasingly tenuous position for lordly organization of production itself. So this is a moment at which climate and famine and agriculture and class struggle come to the fore. And this part is important. Why does something called Europe, which should not be reified, end up going across the Atlantic? Because Europe's ruling classes were defeated by the peasants and working classes of 14th and 15th century Europe. They tried and failed to restore an older, more brutal form of feudalism based on direct labor dues, enforcing low wage statutes and all the rest. It totally failed. This was an absolutely ruinous situation for Europe's ruling strata, for the seigneurs, for the states, for the merchants. But for peasants and workers, it was a golden age, just like it had been in the post-Roman West in the 5th and 6th centuries, where liberated from the jackboots of the Roman legions and aristocratic control, they could actually reorganize production and use more of the surplus, such as it was, for themselves. But this class defeat, as I've suggested, leads to an expansionary imperialist impulse, unlike any other form of imperialism that we see in human history. This is a very stylized painting of Ferdinand and Isabella at the fall of Malaga in 1487. That is right in the thick of the last great Reconquista campaign. the conquest of Granada. At Malaga, every single one of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants was sold into slavery. Why? Because Ferdinand and Isabella had borrowed so much from Genoese and other bankers, they had to find a way to make war pay. And this was a strategy that was used in the conquest of the Canary Islands, in the Reconquista, and then, as we know, in the conquest and commodification of the New World. So this trinity of credit, conquest, and coerced labor was very much present, but then reinvented and radically transformed so that it could be suitable for transforming half the globe almost immediately. And this was a movement to basically find the ways to appropriate the cheap work and cheap natures of every kind across across the New World, and to provide massive opportunities for expanding a productivist apparatus, especially in sugar planting and silver mining as the cores of that productivist reorganization after 1570. It was, and here you can see a map where the zones of genocide and of depopulation overlap almost perfectly with the Brazilian sugar plantations, the Andean silver mining revolution, which was expansive and included a myriad of activities beyond silver production and mercury production, and then the transformations of what are now Ecuador and Colombia, and then of course New Spain, what became Mexico. That the genocides were not just biological accidents of microbes doing their work. For too long we've accepted the immunological determinism implicit in that. Now, this is important for all sorts of reasons, but one of them I want to foreground is that the genocides of the New World, which were carried out to recruit the cheap labor necessary to make the engines of capital accumulation roar, also led to the Orbis Spike. This is a term that we get from Lewis and Maslin, the great biogeographers. And what the red line indicates is the significant carbon drawdown in the atmosphere as a result of forest growback and soils freed from agriculture absorb more carbon. And this contributes to, even earlier than 1610, the first great climate crisis. So here we are. Here's winter severity in Europe, just to give you a picture, a chart. It's always nice to get a sense of what's going on. That's just a very, very simple proxy. But this was also a moment, much as had been the 14th century and then the 5th century for the Roman West, a moment of political crisis and of social revolt almost everywhere, not just limited to Europe. Historians have long called this the global crisis of the 17th century. It was, in fact, a climate crisis. And we want to keep this in mind because the response to this was to move towards frontiers of cheap nature even more vigorously. And this is really where we get this dynamic of slaving, sugar, coerced labor, silver mining, but also other forms of coercive labor arrangements, the great domestication, as I've talked about, and the origins of climate patriarchy, the second serfdom in Eastern Europe, and of course, the origins of climate apartheid. The modern mass slave trade really begins to cohere right around 1570 as the Brazilian sugar revolution takes off. So this is a moment not of mercantile capitalism, and if you've ever been tempted to use that language, I want to encourage you to find a different one, because this is a moment of militarized accumulation and using a synergy of finance and military power to establish new productive opportunities. One of my favorite examples of this is that the Brazilian sugar mill, the core of the Brazilian sugar revolution, often contained a fort within it and contained cannon, because the Brazilian countryside was in a state of open warfare across this period, 1550 to 1700, perhaps epitomized by the great maroon state of Palmeiras. But this was also a moment of fixing the accumulation crisis through the introduction of mass slavery. So this is not just a question of environmental transformation and of human domination, but also of how those two moments link up with the endless accumulation of capital. Here I've taken Eltis's slave database to chart orders of magnitude starting from one increase of economic growth, formal economic growth, and the volume of the slave trade, just to give you a sense of the proportion of it. Now, remember that the genocide of the New World leads to the genocide of the New World leads to the Orbis Spike and the climate crisis. And so that means that there's a labor crisis within the colonies, that some way, some mechanism has to be, an infrastructure of mass slavery has to be developed, which is precisely what we see. So in fact, we don't have one middle passage, we have two. One of indigenous genocide, and then the mass African slavery. How we want to conceptualize that, we can talk about. But it was very much driven by the restless, profitable, but also ecocidal logic of modern agriculture. So remember that industrial agriculture gets its birth certificate in islands like Madeira and Sao Tome, and then really grows into adolescence in Brazil, which righteously should be considered ground zero for the origins of capitalism. The case for treating Brazil and then the West Indies as such is much more persuasive to me than treating Great Britain in the same period. So we see here the synergy of slaving, the slaving frontiers in Africa, the sugar frontiers in the Americas, and the actual practice of slaving. And let me point out, although it sounds very orthodox, that both C.L.R. James in the Black Jacobins and W.E.B. Du Bois insist that the slave is essentially the prototype of the modern proletarian. And I think that there's something important to be said for that point of view. So these are other illustrations, not of trade, the expansion of trade per se, but of the climate fixing dynamic of this first great climate crisis. How was it resolved? Well, colonialism, mass slavery, finding a climate fix by going to the frontier. And that sensibility is very much hardwired in the environmental imaginary today. This is why Elon Musk wants to go to Mars. We see this very much all around us. Well, there's some frontier out there that can come to the rescue of capitalism. I'm not at all convinced. So what we're seeing here is the dynamic of this climate forcing, climate fixing dynamic and the origins of the climate class divide, climate apartheid, and climate patriarchy. And it also points to a reality that I think has been right under our noses all the time, and for various reasons, there's been skepticism and even rejection of this thesis. It's the plantation revolution, not the so-called industrial revolution. Indeed, the plantation revolution was the first industrial revolution. That's where we see the original factory organization, where we see the origins of industrial agriculture, where racialized labor, gendered labor, money, violence, all of the elements of industrialized accumulation come in during this period. The Industrial Revolution is very much a product. And there are lots of reasons for that, but one I want to highlight is what Du Bois called the ultimate exploitation, or super exploitation, was to treat racialized labor and extra-human webs of life as objects or substances to be maximally exploited, exhausted, and then thrown away. So the disposable worker and the disposable life is very much a product of this time. And lest we think that it took the steam engine to affect planetary transformation, not so fast. It was the sugar plantation where we see the really revolutionary landscape revolution of capitalism centuries before the steam engine had a meaningful geohistorical impact on planetary life. So these are key lessons to extract from this moment. And remember that many of the benchmarks of political theory, Locke and Hobbes and Descartes, and then, as we'll see in a moment, Malthus, come out of this era of the Little Ice Age and the kinds of capitalist strategies for dealing with moments of climate and class change and revolt. all right, which is where we are now. So what we don't understand typically is that Malthusianism was very much a product of the climate revolts of the 18th century, from 1783 with the Lockheed Fissure exploding in Iceland, extending to 1815, the date of another volcanic eruption. We have the last great cold snap of the Little Ice Age. Now, I'm not saying that all of these were climate driven, but I'm saying that all of these moments of significant unrest and revolt are moments that that relate to climate. Climate is not everything, but it's hard to explain anything world historical without referencing climate history. So here we have Malthus. Malthus is writing, again, in this moment of a severe climate downturn. He doesn't understand what's going on very well. He doesn't understand that the first agricultural revolution in England has essentially stagnated from 1760. He doesn't even really understand the population has grown. It takes him well after the first essay in 1798 to figure that out. But this is also a climate crisis that, like the middle of the 17th century, was a moment of accumulation crisis. And what do we know about these moments of unfavorable climate shift? We see a push towards expanding, geographical expansion, a drive towards cheap natures. This maps the American dispossession of American Indians in this period in the name of cotton, very much driven by the cotton gin, which comes in the 1790s and provides the technical basis for the revival of slavery on a massive scale. Indeed, if we want to find a key machine, which I don't, but if we wanted to find a key technology of the Industrial Revolution, it would not be the steam engine. It would be the cotton gin. The cotton gin makes possible the steam engine. But also, this is a moment of where industrialization is made possible directly as a result of the plantation revolution. The markets for English textiles, the capital formation for English industrialization itself, the organizational model of the factory, all of these find the plantation revolution at the center. But this is also the era of Malthus, who is not really writing about population. He thinks he is, but what he's really writing about is inequality. For some of you, I know that this quote from Malthus on Nature's Mighty Feast will be familiar, but essentially what he's doing is giving a justification in terms of natural law of social inequality, and this would recur. Indeed, we would see successive Malthusian moments across the next 2 centuries that I'll get to in just a moment. But Malthus's decisive contribution was not about population as such, but taking questions of nature out of history and presenting them as biological or natural laws and imperatives. And so this had a specific ideological purpose. And Malthus, being very much a man of the ruling class, was terrified. He was terrified because the English countryside was an open revolt. This is an era of profound and serious food riots, but also of Spencean radicalism, which was a form of proto-socialism, insisting on the right to subsistence, which had broken with Thomas Paine's radicalism around the question of natural law. Paine had agreed with Adam Smith, not so much for Spence and others who came after him, that here you see a proto-socialist imaginary. So Malthus and Malthusianism has to be understood in terms of class revolt and especially anti-colonial revolt. And these would return again and again and again across the next century. So this will be the sort of closing part of this talk. When we have these Malthusian moments that appear whenever we have multiracial working class revolt or anti-colonial revolt. Of course, there's tremendous overlap between those, but also moments that threaten that. This is especially the case in places like the United States in the era of the great proletarian migrations at the end of the 19th century, where eugenics became necessary to explain through natural law the inequalities of the era and to justify racism. It was a form of, well, not so colorblind, but partly colorblind racism. Of course, eugenics, deeply influential in American environmentalism, all the way in and through the work of Garrett Hardin, Tragedy of the Commons, which we can touch on. But we want to fast forward to the environmental imaginary today and its deep and powerful roots in nuclear hegemony and the doomsday imaginary. So the juxtaposition of these two illustrations is intentional. The bombing of Nagasaki down there on the lower right is directly linked to the fear of the Soviet Union, which had the temerity to, first of all, destroy Nazism in the face of the greatest, well, I don't know the term we want to use, but we're talking about 28 million people who were killed by the Germans. The famous Ostplan East, promulgated in the beginning of the war, said that the Germans, when victorious, would remove 30 to 45 million Russians east of the Ural Mountains. They succeeded in killing about 30 million people. So here we have a dynamic center of anti-colonial possibility, that the Soviet Union, not being a rich country, was very much an anti-colonial struggle in some powerful ways. And the U.S. is sending a clear signal around the Soviet, sending a very clear message to the Soviets in dropping these bombs. Of course, the Japanese were ready to drop them, were ready to surrender probably at least a month before, if not longer. But now we need to encounter the Anthropocenes. And this is important because it relates directly to these questions of power, of history, and how we are using the geological sciences and other sciences in our understanding of human affairs. So as many of you know, we have two sets of markers. One is the residues from nuclear testing, chicken bones and plastics that are deposited into the geological layer. So that's one candidate for the Anthropocene. And the other is what we've seen before, the Orbis Spike from Lewis and Maslin, which goes back to the slaving, genocide, and the long cold 17th century. Now, just take a guess as to which one is more widely accepted amongst geologists. Of course, it's the latter one. And that shows us the continuing power of the two cultures as a way of organizing knowledge. Of course, the term for this era, post-1945, adopted by Anthropocene advocates, is the Great Acceleration, which I think is really a powerful euphemism, because what we're seeing both with the 1610 and 1945 dates are the products, the geological signatures of militarized accumulation that were aimed at securing cheap labor, cheap natures, or pacifying cheap labor. That's the case of the US in the era of decolonization, and wrestling with the question of how do we maintain imperial hegemonic control when everyone in the world is seeking independence. And then also in both cases, 1610 and 1945, the objects of militarized accumulation were savages and barbarians, unwilling or supposedly unable to accept the wisdom of the civilizing project. Now, the popular Anthropocene blurs the lines, and I know that we're just about out of time, so I'm not going to give anyone a quiz on all of this, but we want to pull together all the threads of the popular Anthropocene because the deployment of a physical scientific term for human affairs is a deeply problematic and treacherous move. And so we want to be very clear and conscious about what the popular Anthropocene as a wider imaginary does and what it doesn't do. And it speaks directly to politics of climate crisis. Is it sustainability or planetary justice? Those can be very, very difficult questions. It speaks to the ontology, the political ontology of modernity, this man and nature, or class and climate and humans in the web of life. And it speaks to the origins, how we historicize the crisis, because as I often point out, 1492 never ended. And by the scale of things, 1784, the invention of the rotary steam engine, is a fairly minor affair. So we have this imaginary that very much goes back to the immediate post-war period, but then also the birth of modern environmentalism around an eminently neo-Malthusian mindset. So again, we have Pogo, and we've met the enemy, and he is us. And we have Ehrlich, Paul and Ann Ehrlich, writing in The Population Bomb about what they call the feel of population. He didn't see imperialism. He didn't see that Britain had been destroying and devastating the Indian subcontinent for almost 2 centuries by the time he writes this. It was just dirty and filthy and crowded. Of course, at the time, London had 3 times as many people as Delhi. But, you know, a minor point. But what's Ehrlich really writing in response to? He's channeling a certain zeitgeist of Big E, what would become Big E environmentalism, and that took shape especially out of the population bomb, out of the first Earth Day in 1970, the world revolution of the long 1960s. So just like the classical Malthusianism in the late 18th century comes out of an era of working class, peasant, and anti-colonial revolt, so too, on an even grander scale, the world revolution of the long 1960s. And this was the era of course, the American devastation of Vietnam. It became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. A quote from a US Army major in February 1968 in the Tet Offensive. And Nixon, sensing immediately the appeal, Nixon was a huge Malthusian, and he loved Ehrlich. He set up a presidential commission with Rockefeller, Nelson, I think Nelson, but I get the Rockefellers mixed up sometimes. A population commission in '69. He gives this pro-environmentalist State of the Union message in 1970, just before the first Earth Day, and it's a great sort of whitewashing of what's actually going on in the world. Now, in terms of environmental scholarship, this next connection is very important, and I know that we're just about out of time, so I'm going to try to zip through these, and I'll share my slides on another freely with anyone who wants them. We can see here Alec Wellerstein's map from primary documents of American plans for our first strike nuclear war against Russia and China in 1954. On the upper right, very much related to this, is an illustration of the SAGE air defense system, which comes out of the work of J.W. Forrester, essentially the father of modern systems dynamics. And that comes to us very importantly through the work of Donnell and Meadows and the Limits to Growth a few years later. But we also see these artifacts that are supposed to be about, well, we're all on the same boat, but in fact are the artifacts of American nuclear hegemony, and especially its first strike nuclear war planning. But J. Forrester, who developed this SAGE air defense system, which you can just remind you here, which was very much basically a system designed to shoot down any Russian bombers who survived the American first strike. The US Air Force wasn't even that interested in the North American air defense system in the 50s. Here we have Forrester's systems dynamic model, which is essentially taken and adapted very, very slightly by Donnell and Meadows and her colleagues in The Limits to Growth, a book I find really wonderful in many ways, but we have to understand it comes out of the systems dynamic revolution of this era and the military-industrial complex and the imaginary of doom that went with it. It also feeds very directly into the dream of an automated battlefield, which William Westmoreland was already anticipating in 1969 as he led the American army to defeat in Vietnam, and of course has come to fruition with the Bush, Obama, Trump drone strikes against poor brown people everywhere. So that's a fairly dark note, but what gives us the basis for an ecology of hope? I think that the first thing is that we can remind ourselves that significant climate shifts will unravel the extant political, economic, and cultural arrangements of any kind of class society, including global capitalism today. Now, that doesn't mean something good necessarily comes out of it, but it means that there's a moment of possibility. And so I would suggest this gives us a fundamentally different perspective relative to the climate pessimism widely celebrated both by radicals and mainstream thinkers. I think that there are some lessons that we can extract here. First is that this is not going to be an easy path forward to some version of sustainability and planetary justice. That we have to grapple with the willingness of the imperialist forces to lay waste to its opponents. It became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. Of course, a recurrent phenomena. This is Stalingrad in 1943. We could pick countless images like that. This is Afghanistan in the mid 2000s. Again, the automated battlefield very much in play. So we also have to reckon with the willingness of the 1% to allow the climate crisis to unfold. I think that there's a kind of fragmented and short-termist pathology that goes with the hegemony of finance capital in global governance today. And they're not going to go down without a fight, and they are happy to allow the climate crisis to unfold as long as, and as we've been seeing, this is happening in places like Puerto Rico, the rollout of climate catastrophe continues to provide new opportunities for accumulation. And here we have various images of the climate disasters unfolding. And so I think intellectually the task is really to come to grips with the climate crisis as a differentiated unity. Easier said than done, difficult intellectually, even more difficult in terms of building a movement for planetary justice. So first, yes, of course, we have to embrace the geophysicality of the crisis today, but we also need to build conversations that very much go against the grain of the two cultures, but even go against the grain of so-called interdisciplinarity to link those to questions of capital accumulation, to the long-term slowdown, both in agricultural and labor productivity growth, evident since the 1970s, and other dynamics. So we need to put together questions of power and political economy and the geophysicality of the climate crisis together. We need to insist that the capitalist scene is not just about ecology plus economy. It is about power. It is about climate patriarchy. It is about imperial science. It's about climate apartheid. And we need to be very clear on what kind of crisis this is. There are many, even on the left, who insist that capitalism can survive through the climate crisis. And I don't see evidence for that, but I'm open to having the conversation around it. We need to ask, what kind of crisis is this? Is this a fixable crisis for capitalism, or is it an epochal crisis that resembles, we say, the crisis of feudalism in the 14th century? And just to give you a sense of this, the epochal crises and developmental crises are normal features of civilizational history. These happen. No civilization lasts forever. And then finally, we need to look at what are the possibilities for a feminist, anti-colonial, working class environmentalism that puts the dynamics of reproductive justice in the widest and best sense of that term at the center. How does one bring together the proletariat, the femitariat that is overwhelmingly the work of care work and social reproduction that's heavily feminized? And then after one of your colleagues, Simon Fraser, the biotariat, the disproportionately extra-human webs of life necessary to sustain capital accumulation and devalued for that reason. So that's an intellectual challenge and a pressing political challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your very comprehensive and historically rooted, thought-provoking presentation, Jason. Let's go to questions. There is one, Gabby, would you like to read this question out, please?
Sure. So one of the questions asks, this is by Nick Gottlieb. He asks, I don't want to overstate the risks from AI and robotics because there's often a lot of undeserved hype in this area, but do you think these technologies pose a rather grim-looking challenge to the historical paradigm you've described, in that we are rapidly heading towards a period when the bourgeois may no longer need actual human labor to effect accumulation?
Yeah, it's a very serious question. I'm not convinced that automation in terms of displacing human labor is the thing that we need to worry about. Of course, that line of thought has been with us since the mid-1970s with figures on the Marxist left like Mandel, and then futurologists like Toffler saying everything would be automated. It turns out that maybe where they were right, most of all, is in the automated battlefield. And here is an uncomfortable point. The automated battlefield grows out of the cybernetics military-industrial revolution of US nuclear hegemony. And that is also the terrain where the environmental imaginary developed. And how we put together that is something that I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I would say where we want to be most concerned about is indeed the tendency towards the automated battlefield and how that links up with surveillance capitalism, and then the ongoing production of what Cathy O'Neill, in a wonderful book, calls weapons of mass destruction. That is algorithmic platform capitalism that then links to the automated battlefield and to national security state operations.
Thank you. And the Gabby?
Yep. Thank you so much. Now, Jason Miller asks, can you talk about the narrative of a stolen future that is central to much of youth organizing around the climate crisis and can be identified in the speeches of Greta Thunberg and other young climate activists, and how it relates to the reimagining of humanity, nature that you propose?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I'm not sure that I have a great answer. On the one hand, I'm very inspired by Thunberg and the kinds of conversations she's been willing to bring up, including extending the conversations to questions of colonialism and patriarchy. She's still unwilling to cross the Rubicon that this is a class war. And that's an old-fashioned term, but I cannot think of a better one. And it's a class war in which the world's working classes, broadly defined, have been getting their asses kicked. So we have to come to terms with that. I wonder about, it's a very Swedish statement in this sense that there is this kind of imaginary bench line of, well, there's this future that's just waiting for us if all these other people didn't screw it up. But of course, from the standpoint of colonized peoples and working classes around the world, the future was never all that stable and certain to begin with. In places like the Nordic countries it is, and I spent some time there, so I have a feel for it. It's hard for me to see how that provides an opportunity to build a climate justice movement. I think that it would be more clear if we were to point out that the 1% is engaging by allowing the climate crisis to unfold, is engaging in a kind of strategy of intergenerational mass murder, which I think is accurate.
Thank you so much. I have a question.
Wonderful.
It's not a question, but it's just a conversation piece. I just want to know what you think about this, because I mean, your presentation focus on the end of world idea and as linked to crisis in domination and crisis in accumulation. So basically, you were linking crisis in domination to hegemonic crisis. And if we sort of remind ourselves of Giovanni Arrighi's idea, so Giovanni Arrighi, as you know, explained the rise of American hegemony as based on the long 16th century developments. And for him, the American hegemony was conceptual. I mean, he conceptualized it within the long 20th century. I mean, as we know from the latest election as well, it's not the only indication, but it's one indication. We are seeing the end, perhaps, the American hegemony. It was on decline for a long time, and I am saying that it's over, it's the end. So, and in your interpretation, actually, you link those changes to, in an optimistic way, which I also share, to the reorganization of power dynamics, reorganization of economy, power relations, etc., and from the perspective of class and gender, etc. So my question or my conversation piece is about this. The class is not the same class. We have the mass of, and as you know, Graeber called many of the jobs being created as bullshit jobs. So people who do bullshit jobs are not organized. So how do you actually imagine? And also the other side of that is the crisis is really huge. It extends all aspects of life, right? I mean, the food crisis, economic crisis and all kind of crisis. So how do we imagine reorganization of something better than what we have now in terms of political movements, social justice movements, ecological justice movements, etc., given the fact that we do not have organized forces out there, really? Class is not organized, yeah.
Well, I think part of the problem with the imaginary of social revolutions is that it's very much encaged within the experience of nation states, or multinational states in the case of Russia. So it's the reality, of course, as everyone knows, is there's no White Palace to storm. And so the much more likely outcome of the climate crisis is a dramatic fracturing of the centers of so-called civilization that resemble the breakup of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, that resemble in part the far-flung sort of medieval crises of the 14th century across Eurasia. So we're much more likely to see that kind of fracturing of what we now take for granted, the global transportation, communication, financial integration characteristic of late capitalism. So I think that's one moment of it. I would say that the precariat and the coerced proletariat is the normal condition of the proletariat under capitalism. It's not the Fordist factory worker. And that, but at the same time, what your comment rightly points to is that the world's working classes are fractured along multiple lines. Of course, in the American experience, the long history of the White Republic has been to address the problem of how do we keep black and white workers apart. And that's why anti-communism in the United States was so powerful. How do we keep black and white workers apart? And that's why second wave environmentalism after 1968 was so important and looked upon so favorably by ruling elites. Yes, Reagan was against it, and there was a rule of all these GOP idiots after the 1980s, but the Dems weren't any better. And basically this was big E environmentalism, white environmentalism against environmental justice movements broadly conceived. And that fracture is still very much with us. We have organizations like the Sierra Club who are happy to get into bed with billionaires. And that's not a new, and as late as 2004, 40% of their members voted for an anti-immigrant policy. So those lines go very, very deep. So we have to have a way to realize a multiracial, anti-colonial, proletarian unity. That's an old-fashioned term. It makes me sound like I come out of the Spartacus League or something like that. But the fact is that what we are looking at are the world's working classes as both the producers of value, but also the reproducers of life. And that's the essential point in saying that the proletariat, the biotariat, and the femitariat have to be, and that's a geopoetics, of course, have to be put together. So, but in terms of transition, we can double back, I'll just keep this short, is a Green New Deal has to be careful about this question of transition, because the moment where capital understands that the gain for the bottom 80% of the population is a loss for capital, they are going to experience the same level of violence and counter-revolution that social democrats and revolutionaries experienced in the 1970s. People forget about this very easily, but Whitlam in Australia, Manley in Jamaica, the Wilson government in the UK, Palma in Sweden, we could spend even more time going down that list. These were all movements that weren't revolutionary, but capital was ready to get rid of these, and these are rich country social democratic governments. Well, except for Jamaica, sorry.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. And I also really like your description that we are still in 1492. Yeah, we should not forget.
We are absolutely in 1492. And environmentalists and the main line of eco-socialists refuse to see that 1492 is the turning point, that the genocides and colonialism, that's how capitalism likes to do business. Yeah. That's not somehow just floating out there in the ether, bad Europeans doing stuff. That's how capitalism prefers to do business.
Yeah. Thank you. Gabby, would you like to read the other questions?
Yep. Thank you, Jason. The next question is by Parker Musaral. So to what extent do you consider the emergence of surveillance capitalism as the next great pivot in militarized capital? One with a broad agenda of class enslavement through a techno-nature hybrid model, and one with intense climate consequences given the carbon output of global digital communication infrastructure.
Well, that's one of those questions that really gives the answer perfectly in the statement. Yes, of course, that's a major tendency. The question is, to what degree will that allow increasingly undemocratic and increasingly authoritarian rule? It's very, very difficult to govern heavily proletarianized and heavily professionalized social formations through repression and surveillance alone. The Soviets experienced this in the 1980s. But essentially, the Soviets produced a highly educated, capable, aware working class that would no longer tolerate the conditions of Stalinist or quasi-Stalinist rule. But this is true across the world. And we can look at, anyway, so I think it's easy to overstate the power of surveillance capitalism and the kinds of national security apparatuses that go with it.
Great, thank you. One more by Jason Miller. You are sometimes associated with the new materialist trend in the social and physical sciences. How do you see your work in relation to authors like Karen Barad, Bruno Latour, Vicky Kirby, Jane Bennett, etc., acknowledging that these writers have very different perspectives? And do you think that the contributions of this intellectual movement offer any distinct contributions or ways forward in regards to climate justice?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I have a lot of respect for all of those thinkers that you mentioned. They're all worthy of study and reflection and consideration. Anyone who would associate me with them, frankly, should be embarrassed. That you can go and listen to one of Latour's talks or any of the number of these other folks and look for the history of capitalism, look for environmental history, look for accounts of climate apartheid, look for accounts of the accumulation of capital. This is largely, so I think that while those thinkers have many things to contribute, and I think can contribute to a more complex, nuanced, relational approach, they're also all anti-communist. They're also all anti-dialectical. I don't mean by anti-communist that they have criticisms of the Soviet Union. I mean, they are opposed to the socialist project. They are opposed to the politics of a multiracial feminist working class. They're not there. They're not there. I mean, these are the people who will be very woke and critical and then give money to Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. And I'm sorry, that's fundamentally different. Now, it also says something about, and it's a very polite question, about the self-styled eco-socialists or orthodox Marxists who are making those claims. And haven't we in 2020 got to the point where we can stop calling other Marxists not really Marxists? I mean, I'm just asking. Can we do that? Can we just say we have serious disagreements and move on?
Okay, I will ask one more question to you because I mean I heard my husband upstairs saying come on, so I have to verbalize his question. In terms of surveillance technology, and you said that we shouldn't be sort of dwelling on that so much, kind of. But when we think about the social credit system in China, for example, in relation to oppression of Uyghur, just as an example, I mean, can we really, how can we think about the role of surveillance technologies and when the states uses that as an instrument of oppression?
Now, it's very interesting because not only because the specific content of your question is interesting, but so much of climate or system science is built on planetary surveillance, and which is really, I mean, I hate to be reductive about it because it is more complex, but is decisively managed by the military-industrial complex. So the GPS positioning systems, which I love to use, is maintained by the U.S. Air Force, for instance. So there's that dimension of planetary surveillance that we want to link together with especially the targeted oppression of national minorities. And I think that in those, I don't mean to understate the degree to which platform capitalism and surveillance capitalism can be brought to bear to repress particular struggles. At the same time, if we look at, I mean, China is still really a cauldron of labor unrest. It's been modified somewhat during the recent pandemic, that's true. But it's very hard to govern over the long term through repression and surveillance. And that's, I mean, there's of course a vast literature around this, around legitimation crises and all this. So in the United States, for instance, we have a widespread and pervasive breakdown in trust of basic political institutions in this country. So like you can play all the surveillance to work that you want, and that's not going to revive people's faith in their institutions of governance, which of course is one of the major signs of a legitimation crisis. I think it's much more severe and pronounced in the United States right now, and I can't speak to other places, than at any time since 1972, more or less.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Gabby, because
I have Dan Prisk is asking a question. I think this ending point of hope, looking towards feminists, anti-colonial, and non-dualistic environmental movements is really vital. We already talked a little bit about the popular youth climate movements, but I wonder if you see any already existing spaces of hope for the environmental movements that you're calling for at the end here. In other words, is there anywhere you would suggest we should be looking for inspiration here?
Well, I find inspiration everywhere. I think one of my favorite examples, and I know that Yildiz, you're much more knowledgeable on this point than I am, but food sovereignty broadly conceived is not just a kind of ontological demand that puts together the right to cultural determination with feminism, with climate justice, with the right to food, so in a package, but is also directly a response to the unfolding crisis of capitalist agriculture in the era of climate crisis. We have a long-term secular stagnation in productivity growth in advanced capitalist agriculture. It's partly a result of essentially pesticide, herbicide, fertilizer oversaturation combined with climate change, which is inducing major yield suppression effects. And so that's an example of a holistic contradiction where the movements are in many ways responding to the unfolding crisis of capitalism in very hopeful ways, climate justice movements, but also I mean, there's the reality of movements, like for all of us in our lives, is that they're contradictory. So we want to be aware of the movement to look for something pure. I know at one of my favorite books about the climate crisis is from one of your colleagues at Simon Fraser, Jeff Mann's book with Joel Wainwright on climate Leviathan. And where I differ with them, they end with different climate alternatives. And at the end is climate X, which is sort of an open box. But I often advocate for a climate Castro. That climate Castro, because they say, well, climate now, that's not going to work. First of all, I'm not sure what that means, because we need to get into it. But if we grasp the climate crisis as a clear and present danger to the conditions of life and well-being on Earth, then what is necessary is the massive and serious deployment of state power to build out climate infrastructure. So on the island of Cuba, you are exceedingly unlikely to die from a hurricane. You are 14 times more likely to die from a hurricane in the United States if you live in a stricken area. You have a strategy of social reproduction and also agroecological strategy, which is very contested. But the agroecological fields survive the hurricane season and grow back faster than the conventional industrial ag fields. And so that's an example of the full force and power, or at least significant force and power, of the state to engage the climate threat in a clear and direct way that is also open to popular mobilization, probably not as much as any of us listening would like, but that's always the needle that we need to thread during very dangerous times of how does one weave together the need for popular mobilization with clear and direct and decisive state action. Mm-hmm. And although your colleague Jeff Mann, I don't know if he's listening, but might disagree, I would say that there are actually important lessons to be drawn from the histories of state socialism around that, around rapid industrialization, around Mao and the mass line, around popular mobilizations against imperial invasion. That those are not insignificant moments and provide significant lessons to draw upon as we look to the future. And I'm not saying we all need to emulate and romanticize any of those experiences, clearly not. But let's get over the idea that we can't deploy the power of the state to deal with the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right, so Gabby, before you read the last question from Nicholas Graham, perhaps if there's no other questions, maybe it is the last question, perhaps? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Sure. All right, Nicholas Graham asks, can you elaborate on how an apocalyptic imaginary prevents us from seeing the climate crisis as an opportunity for positive change? It strikes me that those on the radical left that employ an imaginary of doom of gloom, if we don't act very soon, still see resolving the climate crisis as challenge, but also opportunity.
Well, let's be clear that the apocalyptic imaginary is not a product of the radical left. Its most recent history really goes back to the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Doomsday Clock. And in saying that, I'm a huge fan of the Union of Concerned Scientists, historically and in the present. So, but that doomsday imaginary is something embraced by mainstream environmentalism as well as many eco-socialists. What it does is it presents it gives us a permanent state of emergency, which is something that authoritarian forces can and will and have seized upon very readily. And it deprives us of the opportunity to present the climate crisis as an actual political project of actually living and breathing human beings. And so when I say something like the climate crisis is not anthropogenic, made by humans, it is capitalogenic, made by capital, what that does is it directly confronts the apocalyptic imaginary, which is also an imaginary that we have met the enemy and he is us. There's essentially nothing to be done but wait for wait for the rapture to come. This is deeply embedded in the American psyche. And I fear that it's been absorbed by other eco-socialists around the world. Now, of course, and I need to say this in every talk because otherwise people come away and they want to caricaturize, say, well, Moore doesn't think that it's really a danger. Yes, it is a fundamental turning point in the history of planetary life and in human history, the end of the Holocene, and it has been imposing real catastrophes on people. But that's different from saying that we only have 5 years, we only have 10 years. That's not going to get anywhere because it also plays into a global managerial, planetary management perspective, where the solution is essentially a technocratic and technological solution. Let's shoot sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Let's do carbon capture and storage. It resembles in almost every meaningful effect the adoption of population control in India in the 1970s, where it was very, very amenable to Indian ruling classes because it didn't require changing anything except for carving up the bodies of poor women. And so what we have today was essentially a technological, technocratic response. And what we have today is a climate crisis where the dominant anthropocenic imaginary, so all these people using the Anthropocene, are endorsing the system dynamic global managerial strategy of a kind of technocratic, bureaucratic layer of the world's population and hoping that the world's governments will go along. instead of saying that what's necessary is a popular mobilization to transform the systems of production by privileging planetary justice, reproductive justice, in that widest and best sense of that term.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much, Jason. And I really admire your courage because I mean, it's a very alienating situation. You are just talking to a screen. So well done, thank you. And thank you so much for everyone for attending to our afternoon session today. And there are some questions so that I can just respond to it. The talk will be available. It has been recorded already, and it will be available on our website from a week today, I believe, and we will also send it via email to those who attended our session. So either way, you will have access to the talk and discussion, as well as the slides, I believe. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you so much, Jason, again, one more time.
Thank you, Yildiz. Thank you, Gabby, for making this possible and facilitating, and everyone stay healthy.
Likewise.